What did they do? In the long, unrecorded stretch of time when no city walls rose against the horizon, when no kings carved their names into stone, when no chronicles whispered of empires. For nearly 100,000 years, modern humans walked this earth before what we call civilization appeared. A span so vast it dissolves the imagination. A silence so deep it feels deliberate. Did they simply wander? Or did something happen in that darkness that we have forgotten, or chosen to forget? Tonight, as the world around you softens and the weight of the day loosens its grip, we step into that silence together. We follow footprints pressed into ancient mud and preserved in caves older than memory. And before you let your body sink fully into this calm, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet journey truly resonates with you. And if you feel inclined, share your location and local time in the comments. It is a small reminder that, across the globe, others are listening to the same ancient questions under different skies. There is a strange tension in the timeline of our species. Anatomically, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to around 300,000 years ago, show faces that could almost belong to someone passing you on a quiet street today. The bones are real. The dates are measured with care. And yet, for most of that immense stretch of time, there are no pyramids, no cities, no written language, no monumental architecture. Archaeology calls it the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, a time of hunter-gatherers, of small bands moving with the seasons, of firelight flickering against cave walls. But if that is all it was, why does the length of it feel so disproportionate? Why did agriculture appear only around 12,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age? Why did settled life bloom almost simultaneously in distant places? The Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River Basin, Mesoamerica, after tens of thousands of years of apparent stillness? In South Africa, at Blombos Cave, archaeologists uncovered engraved ochre pieces dating back 75,000 years. Cross-hatched patterns scratched deliberately into stone, shell beads pierced and worn, suggesting ornamentation, identity, perhaps even status. These were not beings lost in animal instinct. They were symbol makers, storytellers, creators of meaning. 40,000 years ago in the caves of Europe, paintings of bison, horses, and human-animal hybrids appeared in places like Chauvet and Lascaux. The art is sophisticated, the proportions careful, the sense of movement astonishing. It feels less like the first attempt of a species discovering imagination, and more like the continuation of something already mature. If art requires symbolic thought, and symbolic thought requires language complex enough to sustain shared meaning, then language must have flourished long before the walls of those caves were painted. But language leaves no fossils. It evaporates into air. Its absence in the archaeological record is not evidence of its non-existence. Genetic studies suggest that cognitive modernity, whatever subtle neurological shift allowed abstract thought and long-term planning, may have emerged tens of thousands of years before the first city. The capacity was there, the mind was ready. And yet, the structures of civilization did not immediately follow. Was it climate that restrained them? For much of the last 100,000 years, Earth was locked in cycles of glaciation. Massive ice sheets covered large portions of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were lower by more than 100 meters. Vast coastal plains existed where now there is only ocean. If humans favored coastlines, as many researchers propose, rich in marine life, stable, abundant, then the earliest and perhaps most advanced settlements would now lie drowned beneath rising seas that followed the end of the last ice age. The Younger Dryas, a sudden climatic reversal around 12,900 years ago, introduced chaos into warming patterns. Glaciers melted, sea levels surged, Some have suggested that any proto-civilizations existing along ancient shores could have been swallowed, their memory carried only in myth. Plato wrote of Atlantis, though much later. Flood narratives echo across cultures, from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas. While myths are not evidence in themselves, their recurrence across distant societies invites reflection. Still, mainstream archaeology finds no confirmed evidence of cities older than around 10,000 years. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, dated to roughly 9,600 BCE, startled the academic world. Massive T-shaped pillars carved with animals, arranged in circular enclosures, constructed by people who were, by definition, hunter-gatherers. It challenged the tidy sequence in which agriculture led to settlement, which led to monuments. Here, monuments came first. If hunter-gatherers could organise labour on that scale, what else might they have achieved in the vast ages before? It is tempting to imagine hidden empires lost to time, but speculation must remain tethered to what has been unearthed. There are no verified artifacts of advanced metallurgy from 100,000 years ago, no machines, no concrete, no ceramics beyond what we can trace. The record, fragmentary as it is, does not show skyscrapers beneath the ice. Yet absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when 90% of ancient shorelines now rest underwater. Marine archaeology remains young. The continental shelves, once habitable land, are only beginning to be mapped in detail. Perhaps the question is not why civilization took so long to appear, but whether we misunderstand what those 100,000 years represent. Maybe the measure of progress is not architecture. Maybe stability, adaptation, and survival through brutal climate cycles required a kind of intelligence that left fewer scars on the landscape. For tens of millennia, humans survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, megafaunal extinctions. They navigated without maps. They carried oral histories across generations. They tracked stars long before they named constellations. Some researchers argue that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve memories of sea level rise dating back over 7,000 years, suggesting astonishing continuity of cultural memory. So what were they doing? Perhaps they were refining language, building social networks invisible to us, experimenting with plant knowledge that would later crystallize into agriculture. Or perhaps they were waiting, unknowingly, for a climatic window stable enough to allow surplus and settlement. And then there is the unsettling possibility that cycles existed before, that human societies may have risen modestly and fallen quietly, leaving no monumental ruins to testify to their existence. Not advanced in the way we imagine, but structured enough to be lost. When one considers how easily modern infrastructure would erode without maintenance, how steel rusts, how glass shatters, how cities sink, one wonders how much would remain of us in 50,000 years if all records vanished. The silence of those 100,000 years may not be emptiness, it may be compression. A long inhale before something shifted. But what shifted exactly 12,000 years ago? Was it merely warming temperatures and domesticated wheat? Or was there a deeper turning point, environmental, cognitive, even cosmological, that we have not fully grasped? The shadows before civilization feel less like a void and more like a curtain, and when curtains exist, they imply a stage, either before the performance begins or after something has already taken place. If the curtain truly hides something, then the question is not only what stood behind it, but who decided when it should be drawn. 12,000 years ago, as the last great ice sheets began their uneven retreat, the planet entered a fragile warmth. It was not a smooth transition. The younger Dryas, that abrupt return to glacial conditions, disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Pollen records from Greenland ice cores speak of a world jolted into cold once more before finally surrendering to stability. And within that narrow climatic window that followed, agriculture appeared. Wheat and barley were cultivated in the Levant. Lentils and peas were gathered and tended. In the region that would later be called Mesopotamia, sedentary villages took root. The Natufian culture, dating to around 12,500 years ago, left behind stone sickles and grinding tools. They built semi-subterranean houses. They buried their dead with care, sometimes adorned with shell beads that had travelled hundreds of miles. This does not look like the beginning of intelligence. It looks like the continuation of something that had already matured. For tens of thousands of years before this shift, humans had survived without farming. They had adapted to extreme climates. They had crossed into Australia by sea at least 65,000 years ago, implying boats or rafts and navigational planning. They had entered the Americas perhaps over 15,000 years ago, maybe earlier, moving across Beringia and down ice-free corridors or along Pacific coastlines. They were not primitive in mind, they were mobile by design, so why settle? One theory suggests that climate stability allowed plant domestication to succeed. Warmer temperatures extended growing seasons. Another proposes social pressure, that ceremonial gatherings, perhaps like those implied at Göbekli Tepe, required reliable food supplies to sustain large groups. Klaus Schmidt, the excavator of Göbekli Tepe, once argued that religion may have preceded agriculture, not the other way around. That the need to feed ritual gatherings pushed communities toward cultivation. If this is true, then civilization did not emerge from hunger. It emerged from belief, and belief leaves even fewer fossils than language. Yet even as agriculture spread, something curious unfolded. In multiple regions, monumental structures appeared before fully urbanized societies. Göbekli Tepe is only one example. In southeastern Turkey, its massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, were erected by people who still hunted gazelle and gathered wild grains. No pottery, no writing, no metal tools, only stone and coordination. The site was intentionally buried around 8000 BCE, carefully covered, not destroyed in chaos but sealed. The reason remains uncertain. What knowledge did they protect or conceal beneath that soil? As agriculture expanded, human life changed profoundly. Sedentism allowed population growth. Surplus food led to specialization, pottery, weaving, architecture, eventually writing in Sumer around 3200 BCE. And with writing came history, or at least the version that could be inscribed. Everything before writing is called prehistory. It is a word that implies absence, but perhaps it merely reflects the limits of our preferred evidence. Oral cultures carried epics across generations with remarkable precision. The Rig Veda in India transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. Aboriginal songlines mapping landscapes through melody. Polynesian navigators memorizing star paths across oceans without compasses. If complex knowledge can survive orally for millennia, what might have been carried across those 100,000 years, and what might have been lost in the transition to writing, when only certain voices were granted permanence? Writing centralizes memory. It also filters it. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia speak of kings whose reigns stretch impossibly long in the Sumerian king list. Tens of thousands of years attributed to rulers before a great flood. Scholars interpret these as symbolic exaggerations, and yet the repeated motif of a catastrophic flood dividing time into before and after persists across cultures. Geologists confirm that at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, over 100 meters in total. Coastal plains vanished. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath water. In the Black Sea region, evidence suggests a rapid influx of Mediterranean water around 5600 BCE, potentially displacing communities. While debates continue over the scale of that event, it reflects a broader truth. Coastlines were unstable. If early settlements hugged ancient shores, they are now inaccessible without deep marine excavation. Structures of wood would decay, mud brick would dissolve. Stone, if not monumental, would scatter. Some researchers have proposed submerged structures off the coast of India near Dwarka, in Japan near Yonaguni, and in the Caribbean. Most are contested, often interpreted as natural formations. The line between geology and architecture can be thin in eroded stone. Caution is essential, but so is curiosity. The absence of confirmed underwater cities does not negate the possibility that smaller, sophisticated communities once thrived along drowned lands. Yet there is another dimension to consider. Perhaps the delay in visible civilization was not due to ignorance or incapacity, but preference. Hunter-gatherer societies, even in recent history, often display complex social norms, egalitarian structures, and intimate ecological knowledge. Anthropologists studying groups such as the San of southern Africa or indigenous Australians have documented intricate kinship systems and spiritual cosmologies without monumental architecture. Agriculture, while enabling cities, also introduced hierarchy, labour specialisation, disease concentration, and territorial conflict. Skeletal remains from early farming communities sometimes show signs of nutritional stress compared to earlier foragers. Jared Diamond famously called agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race, though the statement is deliberately provocative. If early humans were capable of building cities long before they did, might they have chosen not to? Might mobility, balance, and low environmental impact have been strategies refined over tens of millennia? Or was there a trigger, an environmental shock, a population bottleneck, a celestial event that disrupted a previous equilibrium? The Toba supereruption in Indonesia around 74,000 years ago may have caused a volcanic winter, though its impact on human populations remains debated. Genetic studies indicate a bottleneck in human ancestry, suggesting our species passed through a period of reduced numbers. Survival through such an event would demand resilience, adaptation, cooperation. Perhaps those long millennia were not idle time. Perhaps they were a training ground. Still, the acceleration after 12,000 years ago feels abrupt, almost impatient, as if a dam had broken. Was it purely climate, or did a threshold of accumulated knowledge finally crystallize into a new form? Language refined enough to coordinate irrigation, astronomy precise enough to mark seasons, social bonds strong enough to sustain inequality. And if knowledge accumulated quietly over 100,000 years, who now holds the authority to define which fragments of it are legitimate? History, as written, begins in cities. But humanity did not begin there. The silence before civilization may not be ignorance, it may be amnesia, and if amnesia exists, it always raises the same unsettling possibility, that forgetting can be accidental or convenient. If forgetting can be convenient, then the next question emerges quietly, almost uncomfortably. Convenient for whom? When writing first appeared in southern Mesopotamia, it did not begin as poetry or philosophy. It began as accounting. Clay tablets from Uruk record barley rations, livestock tallies, labour allocations. The earliest marks of permanence were tools of administration. Civilization did not carve its first words into stone to preserve wonder. It carved them to measure grain. And with measurement came authority. Once a society records surplus, it can record debt. Once it records debt, it can enforce hierarchy. Writing allowed memory to detach from the human body and settle into clay. What was once shared through oral tradition, fluid, communal, adaptable, became fixed, and what is fixed can be curated. The question is not whether early scribes falsified reality. There is no evidence of deliberate deception at that scale. But writing naturally favours those who control it. Temples, palaces, priesthoods. Literacy was not universal. The majority of humanity, for most of recorded history, remained outside the written record. So when we peer back into those 100,000 years before civilization, we are peering through a lens shaped by those who came after. The narrative is constructed retroactively. Prehistory is defined as the absence of writing, yet writing itself is a late arrival. Anthropologists have long debated whether the cognitive leap associated with symbolic behaviour occurred suddenly or gradually. The so-called Upper Paleolithic Revolution, once dated to around 40,000 years ago, was thought to represent a dramatic awakening of art and innovation in Europe. But discoveries in Africa, engraved ochre at Blombos, shell beads in Morocco, bone tools in Kenya, suggest symbolic behaviour existed far earlier. The revolution may not have been a revolution at all. It may have been a migration of visibility. As humans moved into new environments, different preservation conditions allowed certain artefacts to survive. Organic materials decay in humid climates, stone endures. Preservation bias shapes history. Consider the fact that for most of our species' existence, structures were likely built from wood, reeds, animal hides, and earth. These materials return to soil quickly. The absence of wooden architecture from 100,000 years ago tells us little about whether it existed. It tells us only that wood does not fossilize well. There are rare glimpses. At Kalambo Falls in Zambia, researchers recently dated wooden structural remains to nearly 500,000 years ago, attributed not to Homo sapiens but to an earlier hominin. Carefully shaped logs fitted together, not merely tools but constructed space. If earlier hominins could manipulate wood at that scale, what might Homo sapiens have built tens of thousands of years later? The mind capable of engraving ochre 75,000 years ago was capable of conceptual thought. And conceptual thought often seeks structure, yet no confirmed cities from that era remain. The idea of lost advanced civilizations predating known history circulates in popular imagination. Atlantis, Mu, Hyperborea. Scholars treat these as mythological constructs, often allegorical or symbolic. There is no verified archaeological evidence for technologically advanced global empires tens of thousands of years ago. No alloys, no machinery, no industrial residue. But perhaps advanced is the wrong word. What if complexity does not always leave monumental traces? Certain indigenous cultures developed profound astronomical knowledge without building stone observatories. Polynesian navigators read swells and stars with a precision that modern sailors admire. Their maps existed in memory, in woven sticks and shells, ephemeral yet effective. Archaeologist Graham Hancock has argued controversially that a lost Ice Age civilization influenced later cultures, pointing to sites like Göbekli Tepe as evidence of inherited knowledge. His theories remain highly disputed within academic circles, lacking conclusive proof. But the existence of debate itself reveals a subtle discomfort. The timeline of human development is not as linear as once believed. For much of the 20th century, scholars assumed agriculture was prerequisite for monument building. Göbekli Tepe inverted that assumption. It forced a recalibration. If one assumption could collapse, could others? There is also the genetic record. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages reveal patterns of migration and bottlenecks. Around 70,000 years ago, a major dispersal out of Africa reshaped the human map. But genetic data tells us movement, not meaning. It cannot tell us what stories were told around fires, or what cosmologies governed social bonds. Mythologies across continents speak of earlier ages, golden ages, times when humans lived differently. In Greek tradition, Hesiod describes successive ages of man: gold, silver, bronze, iron. In Mesoamerican belief, previous suns were destroyed before the current world emerged. Hindu cosmology speaks of cyclical yugas, descending from an age of truth into decline. These are not historical documents, yet their recurrence across distant cultures invites reflection. Why do so many traditions imagine earlier worlds lost to catastrophe or moral decay? Perhaps it is psychological. Humans project nostalgia backward. Or perhaps collective memory compresses environmental trauma into story. The end of the Ice Age, with its rapid sea level rise and shifting ecosystems, would have been disorienting. Entire coastlines vanishing within generations. Oral traditions might encode such events metaphorically. But if memory can stretch across millennia, What else might it carry beneath its symbolic surface? There is another possibility, less dramatic, yet equally unsettling, that nothing spectacular occurred in those 100,000 years, that humans simply lived, adapted, loved, grieved, and survived in rhythms so sustainable that they left minimal permanent scars. In that scenario, civilization is not the culmination of human potential. It is divergence. Agriculture tethered humans to land. Property emerged. Boundaries hardened. Warfare intensified. Writing preserved power structures. History accelerated. Perhaps the long Paleolithic was not empty time, but equilibrium. And if equilibrium persisted for tens of millennia, what disrupted it so decisively around 12,000 years ago? Climate alone may not explain the scale of social transformation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a possible cometary event triggering sudden cooling, though this remains controversial and debated within geology. Evidence for widespread impact remains inconclusive. Still, the idea lingers, a shock to the system, a forcing function. Or perhaps the forcing function was internal, population growth reaching a threshold, language achieving recursive complexity, symbolic systems becoming dense enough to coordinate large groups beyond kinship. If so, then civilization was not imposed from outside, it emerged from accumulated cognition. Yet accumulation implies continuity, and continuity suggests that what came before mattered more than we acknowledge. The silence of those 100,000 years is not absence. It is compression beneath layers of sediment, both literal and intellectual. And if compression builds pressure, one must wonder what remains sealed beneath the strata of our official timeline, waiting not to overturn history but to remind us how fragile our definitions of it truly are. If forgetting can be convenient, then the next question is quiet but persistent. Convenient for whom? The rise of cities did not simply create architecture, it created archives. Clay tablets in Sumer, hieroglyphs along the Nile, oracle bones in ancient China. These were not neutral acts of memory. Writing stabilized power. It allowed taxation, law, lineage, decree. It transformed fluid oral traditions into fixed narratives, curated by those who could afford scribes and storehouses. Before that, memory belonged to the group. For tens of thousands of years, knowledge moved from mouth to ear, from gesture to imitation. Skills were embodied. How to track a wounded animal by the angle of a bent blade of grass. How to read weather in the scent of wind. How to navigate by stars that rotated predictably across an ice age sky. These were not trivial arts. They were survival technologies refined over unimaginable spans of time. And yet, because they left no monuments, they are treated as prelude rather than achievement. Consider the complexity of Paleolithic toolkits. The Levallois technique, used by both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, required abstract planning. A core stone was shaped deliberately, so that a single strike would release a flake of predetermined size and shape. This is not improvisation. It is foresight. It is geometry enacted through muscle memory. Blades from the Upper Paleolithic, microliths fitted into composite tools, bone needles used to stitch tailored clothing during glacial periods, these reveal minds attuned to precision. There is no intellectual vacuum here, and then there is art again. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, cave paintings of hand stencils and animals have been dated to over 45,000 years ago. In Spain, red pigment marks attributed to Neanderthals may reach back 64,000 years. If Neanderthals marked cave walls intentionally, then symbolic expression predates even our own species' dominance in Europe. The story becomes less linear, less triumphant. If symbolic thought is ancient and technological competence is ancient, then why does monumental architecture cluster so tightly within the last 12,000 years? Why do cities bloom after such an extended quiet? One explanation rests in population density. For most of human existence, numbers were low. Genetic models estimate that global populations may have been under a few million individuals for long stretches. Small groups dispersed across vast territories rarely generate surplus sufficient to sustain non-subsistent specialists. No scribes without farmers, no priests without granaries. But density alone does not account for the suddenness. At the end of the last ice age, megafauna vanished across continents. Mammoths in North America, giant kangaroos in Australia, woolly rhinoceroses in Eurasia. The causes remain debated: climate shifts, human hunting, or a combination. Whatever the trigger, ecosystems reorganized. Large game grew scarce. Some researchers suggest that this ecological pressure nudged humans toward plant domestication, toward control rather than pursuit. Control is a threshold concept. Once humans learned not merely to gather but to cultivate, they altered landscapes deliberately. Forests cleared, rivers redirected, seeds selected generation after generation for desirable traits. This is a form of genetic engineering enacted slowly, patiently, across centuries. It marks a psychological shift as much as a technological one. The earth becomes substrate, yet cultivation also binds. A field cannot migrate when seasons fail. A granary cannot flee invasion. Sedentary life accumulates wealth and vulnerability. In early Mesopotamian cities such as Uruk, by 3500 BCE, monumental temples rose. Administrative tablets recorded transactions. Hierarchies solidified. The earliest laws emerged, defining property and punishment. It is tempting to see this as progress. But progress toward what? Archaeological evidence suggests that early urban life brought disease burdens unknown to nomadic bands. Close proximity to domesticated animals introduced zoonotic illnesses. Skeletal remains reveal signs of labour stress, inequality in burial goods, nutritional disparities. Civilization offered continuity and constraint. If one imagines a human community 100,000 years ago, living in a rhythm synchronized with seasons, aware of stars without claiming them, holding stories that bound generations without inscribing them, is that absence of civilization, or a different expression of it? The word civilization itself derives from civitas, city. It privileges walls and streets over networks of kinship and memory. Perhaps the deeper rupture is semantic. Still, the clustering of myths around a lost golden age persists. Hesiod spoke of ages of man, gold, silver, bronze, declining from an original harmony. Hindu cosmology cycles through yugas, vast epochs rising and falling in moral and spiritual clarity. Mesoamerican traditions describe successive suns, worlds destroyed and remade. These are not scientific accounts, yet their recurrence across cultures invites a subtle unease. Do they encode distant memories of environmental collapse? Or are they archetypes born from the human tendency to idolize origins? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that a comet or fragmented meteor struck Earth around 12,800 years ago, triggering abrupt cooling and possibly contributing to megafaunal extinctions. Evidence cited includes microspherules and nanodiamonds found at certain archaeological sites. The hypothesis remains controversial, debated intensely within geological circles. Some data support unusual impact signatures, others question contamination and dating methods. If such an event occurred, its shockwaves, literal and cultural, would ripple across continents. Oral traditions might transmute it into flood myths, fire from the sky, divine wrath. But caution remains essential. Extraordinary claims demand rigorous evidence, and yet, even without cosmic impact, the end of the Ice Age was dramatic enough. Glacial meltwater pulses raised seas rapidly. Landscapes familiar to generations disappeared within centuries. Communities would have been displaced. Memory fractured. What happens to knowledge when the land that anchors it sinks beneath waves? Does it dissolve or adapt? Perhaps the 100,000 years before cities were not empty but preparatory, a long apprenticeship in resilience, a refinement of language, cooperation, symbolic imagination. A reservoir of cognitive capacity that, once environmental conditions stabilized, expressed itself in temples and irrigation canals. Or perhaps something else occurred, something subtle enough to evade stone and bone, a shift in consciousness, a reorganization of social structures, an agreement, spoken or unspoken, that permanence was now desirable. If permanence is the key, then writing becomes its instrument. And once writing defines the official past, everything before it becomes negotiable. The silence of prehistory may not conceal skyscrapers or forgotten engines. It may conceal alternative ways of being human, ways that left no ruins precisely because they did not seek them. The more closely one listens to that silence, the less it feels like absence and the more it resembles restraint. And restraint always implies choice. The question lingers gently, almost imperceptibly. Were those 100,000 years a delay, or a different kind of mastery that we have mistaken for emptiness? If restraint implies choice, then another question surfaces with quiet insistence. What kind of intelligence chooses not to dominate its environment? For nearly 100,000 years, Homo sapiens moved across continents without leaving behind cities, walls, or vast scars in the earth. And yet they crossed oceans. They endured ice ages. They painted ceilings of caves that required scaffolding and flickering torchlight to reach. They buried their dead with flowers, as pollen traces in Shanidar caves suggest Neanderthals may have done more than 60,000 years ago. Care preceded architecture. The human mind was not waiting to awaken. It was already awake. The discovery of Denisovans through fragments of bone in Siberia, and the realization that modern humans carry traces of their DNA, reminds us that the human story is braided. Multiple hominin species coexisted, interbred, shared landscapes. Cultural exchange may have occurred in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. Knowledge might not have flowed linearly from primitive to advanced, but laterally across groups. Perhaps what we call civilization was not the inevitable endpoint of intelligence, but one branch among many possible expressions. Consider the fact that for tens of millennia, humans thrived in balance with megafauna without systematically erasing ecosystems. The extinction patterns at the end of the Ice Age complicate this view, but even then, the scale of transformation did not resemble industrial acceleration. There were no mines strip-cutting mountains, no cities consuming forests at continental scale. Mobility limited accumulation. Accumulation limits power. In nomadic societies, wealth cannot exceed what can be carried. Status may derive from skill, storytelling, or generosity rather than stored surplus. Anthropologists observing hunter-gatherer groups often note social mechanisms that prevent dominance from becoming entrenched. Ridicule of arrogance, sharing norms that diffuse hoarded resources. These are not simplistic communities. They are structured in ways that preserve cohesion. Agriculture altered that equilibrium. Once fields required defense, boundaries hardened. Once harvests could be stored, they could be taxed. Once labor could be organized seasonally, it could be compelled. The archaeological record in the Fertile Crescent reveals increasing social stratification over time. Burial sites begin to show inequality, some graves richer in goods than others. Walls rise around settlements such as those at Jericho around 8000 BCE. Whether for defense against floods or other communities remains debated. But enclosure signifies anxiety. Fear becomes architectural, and with architecture comes narrative. The earliest myths recorded in Mesopotamia speak of divine kingship descending from heaven. The Sumerian king list describes rulers whose reigns before a great flood lasted tens of thousands of years, then sharply contracts to more plausible spans after the deluge. Scholars interpret these immense rains symbolically. Yet the structure, before the flood, after the flood, mirrors geological transitions. The flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, echoed later in biblical tradition, may reflect real inundations following glacial melt. But it also demarcates time into eras. Why do so many cultures divide history around catastrophe? Perhaps because catastrophe resets hierarchy. It wipes clean land claims. It disrupts lineages. It levels monuments. If early coastal settlements were submerged, their memory would survive only through story. Oral traditions of rising waters persist in Aboriginal Australian narratives, some describing coastlines that match paleogeographic reconstructions from 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. Such continuity suggests that memory can outlive stone, but memory transforms as it travels. When writing eventually captured myth, it fossilized one version. And here another subtle tension emerges. What if the so-called silence before civilization is not silence at all, but erasure through standardization? Once urban centers became dominant, they redefined legitimacy. Nomadic life became primitive, agricultural surplus became progress, written law became truth. Everything outside those parameters became prelude. There is no evidence of global advanced technology predating known history. No confirmed ruins of lost continents brimming with machinery. Responsible scholarship demands restraint. But responsible curiosity asks different questions. What if knowledge once existed in forms incompatible with permanence? What if entire cosmologies were encoded in ritual movement, in seasonal migration routes, in acoustic properties of landscapes rather than carved stone? Archaeological research increasingly explores archaeoacoustics, the study of sound in ancient sites. Certain caves with Paleolithic art exhibit resonant properties that amplify voice. Some researchers propose that sound and ritual were intertwined with imagery. If so, these spaces were not galleries but chambers of experience. Experience leaves faint traces. Similarly, archaeoastronomy examines alignments of ancient structures with celestial events. While megalithic sites such as Stonehenge date much later, the human awareness of solstices and equinoxes surely predates agriculture. Tracking seasonal cycles would be essential for survival even among foragers. To observe the sky consistently for millennia without erecting permanent observatories requires patience and oral precision. Perhaps the knowledge was embedded in story rather than stone. Then climate stabilized. The Holocene offered a rare window of relative predictability. Rainfall patterns became less volatile. Temperature swings narrowed. In this stability, agriculture flourished. In agriculture, surplus accumulated. In surplus, hierarchy solidified. Was civilization born from opportunity, or from fear of instability returning? Once ice sheets retreated and seas rose, those who survived may have sought anchors. Fields fixed to earth, temples fixed to sky, writing fixed to clay. Fixation counters impermanence, yet impermanence is older. For 100,000 years humans lived within flux. They adapted rather than anchored. They moved with herds, with coastlines, with climate oscillations. Their success lay in flexibility. Civilization, by contrast, invests in immobility, and immobility creates vulnerability. Drought collapses cities, salinization ruins fields. In Mesopotamia, irrigation led over centuries to soil degradation, contributing to shifts in power from Sumerian to Akkadian, and later Babylonian dominance. Empires rose and fell not solely through conquest, but through environmental strain. Perhaps the first true revolution was not agriculture, but the decision to remain. Remain in one place long enough to build monuments. Remain long enough to write laws. Remain long enough to forget how to move without them. If the long Paleolithic was an era of mastery through movement, then civilization inverted that mastery into control through permanence. Control generates records. Records generate official beginnings. Everything before becomes shadow. Yet shadows often preserve shapes more honestly than statues. And as one traces the arc from nomadic bands beneath glacial skies to priests inscribing tablets in Uruk, a subtle unease persists. Was the shift inevitable? Or was it a narrowing of possibility? If humans once thrived for tens of millennia without cities, what did they know about balance that we have since unlearned? And if that knowledge left no ruins because it required none, what would it take for us to recognize it again? If immobility created permanence, and permanence created history, then another question lingers in the quiet space between epochs. What did movement preserve that stillness could not? For most of their existence, humans were not settlers. They were travellers of shifting corridors, river valleys swelling and shrinking, grasslands advancing and retreating with glacial breath, coastlines expanding into vast plains during ice ages, only to be reclaimed by rising seas. These landscapes were not static backdrops. They were living calendars, marking time through transformation. To survive within such volatility required more than brute endurance. It demanded anticipation. Ice cores from Greenland reveal abrupt climatic shifts occurring within decades. To those living through them, seasons would not simply change, they would betray expectation. Rivers that once ran reliably might freeze earlier. Animal migration patterns could falter. Plants might flower at altered intervals. In such a world, flexibility was intelligence. Hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists demonstrate intimate environmental literacy. Knowledge of hundreds of plant species, medicinal properties, animal behaviours, microclimates within valleys. These are not casual observations, they are cumulative archives held in memory. And memory, when shared collectively, becomes resilient. Yet memory without inscription depends on continuity. It requires elders who remember, rituals that reenact, stories that bind. What happens when continuity fractures? At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 metres. Vast coastal plains, Doggerland between Britain and mainland Europe, Sunderland in Southeast Asia, the exposed continental shelf of the Persian Gulf, vanished. These were not marginal territories. They were habitable, fertile, attractive. Marine geologists have mapped submerged river channels beneath the North Sea, evidence of landscapes where humans likely once walked. Artifacts dredged up by fishermen hint at Mesolithic life in regions now underwater. But systematic excavation beneath shifting currents remains technically difficult. If entire communities existed along those coasts for millennia, their physical traces may lie scattered beneath sediment. The Persian Gulf hypothesis, proposed by archaeologist Geoffrey Rose, suggests that during lower sea levels, the Gulf basin formed a fertile refuge, perhaps even a cradle for early human populations. As waters rose, inhabitants would have been displaced, migrating into Mesopotamia and carrying with them stories of inundation. This remains a hypothesis, supported by paleogeographic reconstruction, but limited by direct archaeological evidence. Yet it aligns with a broader pattern. Environmental transformation shaping migration. Movement disperses knowledge, but it also dilutes concentrated structure. One wonders whether certain thresholds of stability are prerequisites for monumental expression. Without predictable harvest cycles, how does one justify investing labour in stone that may outlast a season? Without surplus, how does one free individuals from food procurement to specialise as builders or scribes? Agriculture solved the problem of predictability, temporarily. But agriculture itself may have arisen from incremental experimentation long before formal domestication. Evidence from Ohalo II in Israel suggests that wild cereals were gathered and processed 23,000 years ago. Grinding stones bear residue of starch grains. These were not farmers yet, but they were experimenting. Experimentation implies curiosity, and curiosity over tens of millennia accumulates quietly. The archaeological record is uneven, but hints accumulate of complexity long before cities. Burials at Sungir in Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, contain elaborate grave goods, thousands of ivory beads meticulously crafted and sewn onto garments. The time investment required to produce such ornaments suggests social differentiation or symbolic roles, status without cities, identity without walls. Similarly, at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, around 7,500 BCE, houses were built densely without streets, accessed through roofs. Murals adorned interiors. Burials occurred beneath floors. The site reflects a transitional world, neither purely nomadic nor fully urban in later sense. Yet even Çatalhöyük appears relatively suddenly after the Ice Age. What bridged the earlier tens of thousands of years to these proto-urban forms? Some researchers argue for gradualism, small-scale settlements emerging in favourable niches, expanding incrementally. Others note punctuated shifts, rapid clustering following climatic stabilisation. There is also the cognitive dimension. Language complexity likely deepened over time. Recursive grammar allows infinite combinations from finite vocabulary. Once language reaches a certain density, it can encode abstract concepts, law, cosmology, property. But language leaves no fossil record. Its evolution is inferred indirectly through symbolic artifacts. The engraved patterns at Blombos, the beads from North Africa, the cave paintings in France, these are not utilitarian. They suggest that humans were already living within layered symbolic worlds long before writing. If symbolic richness existed for tens of thousands of years, then civilization did not create imagination. It redirected it. Temples replaced caves. Myths became canon. Ritual became institutional. Institutionalization preserves and excludes. Once a centralized belief system forms, alternative narratives diminish. Oral diversity narrows into official theology. The Church in medieval Europe later curated scripture and suppressed certain texts deemed heretical. Ancient empires likewise elevated particular myths to legitimize power. History becomes selective. It is tempting to project such mechanisms backward, imagining intentional erasure of earlier ages. But evidence for deliberate suppression of a technologically advanced prehistoric civilization does not exist. What does exist is a pattern. Dominant systems redefine the past to justify the present. Nomadic life becomes backward. Sedentary agriculture becomes destiny. And yet, archaeological discoveries continue to complicate neat timelines. Stone tools in Arabia dated to over 80,000 years ago reveal migrations across landscapes once assumed barren. Human footprints preserved in Saudi Arabia suggest presence near ancient lakes. The map of habitation expands. The more evidence accumulates, the less empty the Paleolithic appears. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that a lost empire once glittered and vanished. It is that for 100,000 years, humans sustained themselves without constructing systems that eventually strained ecosystems. If that is true, then civilization is not merely an ascent. It is a pivot from adaptability to accumulation. Accumulation demands record. Record demands authority. Authority defines beginnings. And so the vast stretch before written chronicles becomes a prologue rather than a chapter. But prologues often contain the essential premise. If humanity survived glacial oscillations, supervolcanic eruptions, migrations across continents, without cities for tens of millennia, what forms of social intelligence made that possible? What agreements were made around ancient fires that left no inscription, yet shaped survival more profoundly than any law code? And if those agreements were based on balance rather than expansion, what might that imply about the fragility of the path chosen 12,000 years ago? The oceans keep their submerged plains. The sediments hold their quiet. The stones reveal only fragments. Perhaps the silence before civilization is not emptiness, but an inheritance waiting to be remembered differently. If accumulation was the pivot, then the next question unfolds almost imperceptibly. What did humans begin to accumulate first? Grain, or stories about ownership? The shift from mobility to settlement did not merely anchor bodies, it anchored identity to land. For tens of thousands of years, territory had meaning, but it was porous. Boundaries followed herds and seasons. They were negotiated through kinship, ritual exchange, sometimes conflict, but rarely inscribed permanently into soil. Agriculture altered that grammar. A field must be defended through time. A harvest requires predictable labour. Surplus invites storage, and storage invites protection. The earliest granaries in the Levant, dating to around 10,000 BCE, suggest communities were not only cultivating crops but planning for future scarcity. Planning implies trust in continuity. It also implies fear of disruption. Fear leaves marks. At Jericho, the massive stone tower and wall, constructed around 8000 BCE, rise abruptly in the archaeological record. Scholars debate their purpose: defense against flooding, symbolic monumentality, protection from rival groups. Whatever the function, they represent collective labour on a scale unnecessary for small mobile bands. Enclosure signals anxiety about loss. Yet this anxiety may have roots deeper than agriculture. Ice core data reveal that the Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Temperatures in Greenland rose sharply within decades. For communities alive at that time, the world would have seemed unstable, unpredictable. Memories of cold returning unexpectedly might linger across generations. In such an atmosphere, permanence becomes attractive. The domestication of animals followed similar patterns. Goats and sheep in the Near East, pigs in Anatolia, cattle in multiple regions. Each domestication event required sustained observation and selective breeding. These were not spontaneous breakthroughs. They were cumulative experiments stretching across centuries. Domestication also reshaped human biology. Lactase persistence in certain populations evolved in response to dairy consumption. Agricultural diets altered dental patterns. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show reduced stature compared to their foraging predecessors in some regions, likely reflecting dietary changes. Civilization did not simply build cities, it rewrote bodies. But what of the mind? Neuroscientific research suggests that prolonged engagement with complex social hierarchies and symbolic systems can reshape cognitive processing. Writing externalizes memory, reducing reliance on oral recall. Specialization narrows skill sets while deepening others. If Paleolithic life required broad competence, hunting, tracking, tool-making, storytelling, then early agricultural societies began to distribute expertise more narrowly. Specialization accelerates innovation. It also fragments knowledge. One person farms, another records, another governs. Knowledge becomes compartmentalized. Perhaps something was lost in that fragmentation, an integrated awareness of environment that mobility enforced. Yet one must resist romanticizing the Paleolithic. Life expectancy was lower, infant mortality high. Injury could be fatal without medical intervention. For all its burdens, civilization brought sanitation systems, organized healthcare in later eras, architectural shelter against harsh climates. The question is not whether one era was superior, it is whether the long pre-civilized span was truly dormant. Archaeological evidence continues to expand. The discovery of stone tools in North Africa, dated to over 100,000 years ago, associated with Homo sapiens, reveals early technological sophistication. The use of pigments suggests aesthetic sensibility. Burials in Kafsa cave in Israel around 90,000 years ago include grave goods, hinting at spiritual beliefs. Spirituality predates cities. Cognitive archaeologists propose that symbolic burial reflects awareness of mortality and perhaps metaphysical speculation. If humans contemplated death and afterlife tens of thousands of years before temples, then existential reflection is not a byproduct of civilization. It is an inheritance. What then was humanity doing for 100,000 years? They were thinking. They were telling stories about stars without mapping them into constellations on parchment. They were naming rivers without carving the names into tablets. They were negotiating alliances without codifying law. They were constructing meaning in forms that decayed gracefully. And decay leaves little for archaeologists to excavate. There is also the genetic dimension of memory. Cultural practices influence gene flow. Marriage patterns, migration corridors, population bottlenecks, these shape the human genome. The genetic record suggests waves of expansion and contraction long before cities. Around 70,000 years ago, a dispersal out of Africa seeded populations across Eurasia. Around 40,000 years ago, modern humans entered Europe and eventually replaced Neanderthals, though interbreeding occurred. These transitions required adaptation not just technologically but socially. Encounter with another hominin species would demand negotiation, competition, exchange, perhaps even shared knowledge. What ideas passed between them that left no inscription? When Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, it was not necessarily a sudden extinction. Some may have been absorbed genetically into Homo sapiens populations. Their disappearance complicates the narrative of linear progress. Intelligence was not exclusive. If multiple human species coexisted and interacted, then the pre-civilized world was not monolithic. It was plural. Plurality resists centralization. Perhaps the eventual rise of cities represented a narrowing, one adaptive strategy among many becoming dominant. The agricultural revolution, once considered inevitable, now appears contingent. Certain regions never fully adopted agriculture for millennia, despite contact with farming societies. Hunter-gatherer lifeways persisted in Australia, the Arctic, parts of Africa and the Americas long after cities rose elsewhere. This suggests that agriculture was not universally compelling. If so, the question deepens. Why did certain populations embrace permanence so decisively? Climate may have played a decisive role. The Holocene stability provided predictable rainfall patterns in regions like the Fertile Crescent, but stability itself is rare in geological time. Perhaps civilization emerged during an unusual climatic window, an interlude of calm in Earth's restless history. If that window closes, what then? Ice cores, sediment layers, pollen analysis, all reveal that climate oscillates. The long Paleolithic spanned multiple glacial cycles. Humans adapted through mobility. Civilization, bound to fields and walls, adapts differently. When one considers the brevity of recorded history compared to the immense silence before it, the ratio becomes almost disorienting. 100,000 years of movement, 12,000 years of settlement, 5,000 years of writing. The official narrative occupies a fraction of human time. What if that fraction shapes our imagination disproportionately? Perhaps the question is not what humans were doing for 100,000 years before civilization. Perhaps it is what we are forgetting about ourselves because we define humanity by cities alone. If survival, adaptation, storytelling and symbolic thought sustained our species through glacial epochs without skyscrapers or scripts, then the silence before civilization may be less a void than a mirror. And mirrors, when held long enough, reveal not only what stands before them, but what has quietly stepped away. If the long silence before cities is a mirror, then it reflects something unsettling back at us. The possibility that civilization is not the full expression of humanity, but a particular experiment within it. For nearly 100,000 years, humans lived in what archaeologists label as the Paleolithic, yet the word itself is a simplification. It compresses thousands of generations into a single phrase, Old Stone Age, as though those millennia were static. But nothing in Earth's history remained static for long. Glacial maxima advanced and retreated. Grasslands became deserts. Deserts became lakes. The Sahara, now vast and arid, once held rivers and savannas rich with wildlife. Rock art in the Tassili Naja region of Algeria depicts cattle and swimmers in landscapes that are now barren. These paintings are not primitive scribbles, they are records of ecological transformation. Human communities adapted to these changes continuously. Adaptation is not merely survival, it is decision-making under uncertainty. It is recalibration without written instruction. It is collective intelligence unfolding in real time. Recent archaeological work in northern Arabia has uncovered footprints of humans and animals preserved in ancient lake beds, dated to around 120,000 years ago. The presence of Homo sapiens in such regions earlier than once believed complicates the migration narrative. It suggests exploratory waves into environments previously assumed uninhabitable. The more discoveries accumulate, the more the image of early humanity expands, not as isolated bands clinging to existence, but as dynamic explorers. Yet exploration leaves faint traces. Unlike cities, which concentrate debris, mobile societies disperse their footprints lightly. Campsites are ephemeral, tools are carried and reused, fire pits fade into soil. Perhaps the invisibility of these societies is not evidence of absence, but of efficiency. There is also the matter of social cohesion. For small groups to survive harsh climates, cooperation would have been essential. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that our species' success may hinge less on individual strength than on collaborative flexibility. Shared childcare, food sharing, reciprocal altruism, these are not incidental traits, they are structural. Civilization complicates cooperation through scale. Anonymous populations require laws rather than personal bonds. Institutions replace intimate trust, but intimacy sustained humanity far longer than bureaucracy. And then there is the sky. Long before observatories, humans watched the movements of stars. The regularity of celestial cycles would have been among the few predictable elements in a volatile world. The precession of the equinoxes, though subtle and requiring centuries to detect, has been suggested by some researchers to be encoded symbolically in ancient myth. This remains speculative, debated within archaeoastronomy, but the idea itself underscores a deeper truth. Attention to the cosmos predates writing. Orion's belt rose and set long before it was named. The Milky Way arced overhead during glacial nights. Perhaps orientation, both geographic and existential, was rooted in celestial observation. When agriculture tethered humans to fields, calendars became essential. Tracking solstices ensured planting and harvest aligned with seasons. Stone alignments at later Neolithic sites, such as Nabta Playa in Egypt, dated to around 6000 BCE, suggest early attempts to formalize sky observation. Yet skywatching must have preceded these stones. It is possible that the 100,000 years before civilization were spent refining perception of land, of stars, of each other, a long apprenticeship in pattern recognition. Pattern recognition underlies myth. Myths encode ecological memory. Flood stories may reflect rising seas. Fire from the sky narratives may echo meteor events, such as the impact that created the meteor crater in Arizona around 50,000 years ago, an event Homo sapiens in the region could have witnessed. But memory transforms through retelling. The challenge lies in distinguishing metaphor from event. Some modern writers argue that ancient myths preserve records of advanced lost civilizations. Mainstream archaeology finds no credible evidence of industrial or high-technology societies tens of thousands of years ago. What the record does reveal is ingenuity within environmental constraints. The controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Hearths structured social life, light extended waking hours. Storytelling around fire likely shaped cultural continuity. Perhaps those long millennia were not defined by technological stagnation, but by deepening narrative sophistication. Narratives create identity. Identity shapes cooperation. When agriculture emerged, narrative shifted toward land ownership and divine sanction of hierarchy. Deities became patrons of cities. Kings ruled by cosmic mandate. The scale of myth expanded to match the scale of settlement. But the roots of myth reach deeper. Cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet are not mere depictions of animals. Some researchers propose they reflect shamanic practices, altered states of consciousness induced by rhythmic sound or darkness. Neuropsychological theories suggest that certain geometric patterns in cave art resemble entoptic phenomena experienced during trance states. If Paleolithic humans explored altered consciousness, then the interior landscape was as significant as the exterior. Civilization externalizes power in monuments. Paleolithic spirituality may have internalized it. This is not romantic idealization. It is recognition of different expressions of complexity. The emergence of agriculture and settlement around 12,000 years ago coincided with the Holocene's relative climatic stability. But stability is precarious in geological time. The Paleolithic endured far longer under instability. What does that imply about resilience? When considering the ratio, 100,000 years of mobility to 12,000 years of settlement, the scale becomes almost humbling. Civilization occupies a narrow corridor within human history. And within that corridor, written records occupy an even narrower band. Perhaps the question is not what humans did before civilization, but why we equate civilization with awakening at all. What if awareness, cooperation, symbolic thought, and adaptation flourished long before stone walls rose? If so, then the silence before cities is not empty. It is saturated with lives lived without the need for permanence. And if permanence defines our present age, one cannot help but wonder whether the qualities that sustained humanity through ice and flood, flexibility, restraint, distributed memory, remain dormant within us. The mirror of the Paleolithic does not accuse, it simply reflects. It reflects a species capable of surviving without monuments, and that reflection invites a final, uneasy thought. If humans once endured for tens of millennia without cities, what will endure of us if our cities fall silent? If cities were an experiment, then experiments imply risk. 12,000 years ago, as glaciers retreated and coastlines redrew themselves, humans began rearranging the surface of the earth in deliberate ways. Fields replaced wild grasses, herd animals were enclosed, rivers were guided into channels. What had once been negotiated season by season became engineered for continuity. Engineering creates confidence, yet confidence can blur memory. For nearly 100,000 years, human communities had survived through attentiveness to shifting conditions. Climate oscillated, prey migrated, landscapes transformed. Mobility was insurance. Knowledge was stored in the body and the group. But settlement required a different kind of insurance. Walls, granaries, written contracts. The earliest irrigation systems in Mesopotamia demonstrate an astonishing coordination of labour. Channels diverted water from the Tigris and Euphrates, sustaining crops beyond natural flood cycles. This was not accidental. It required planning across seasons, across generations. Such planning signals a psychological pivot from responding to nature toward reshaping it. But reshaping nature binds one to its consequences. Soil salinization in ancient Sumer eventually reduced agricultural yields. Clay tablets record declining grain production over centuries. Environmental strain translated into political instability. Empires rose and fractured. Civilization introduced a feedback loop unfamiliar to nomadic bands. Environmental modification, accelerating vulnerability. One wonders whether the deep memory of earlier instability, of ice sheets advancing, of coastlines drowning, lingered in collective consciousness as agriculture took root. Did the first farmers fear the return of chaos? Did walls symbolize not conquest, but protection against a world remembered as unpredictable? There is evidence that the transition to agriculture was not smooth or universally welcomed. Skeletal remains in some early farming communities show increased evidence of conflict. Cranial trauma fortified settlements. Agriculture concentrated resources. Concentration invited competition. Competition requires justification. Religion expanded in parallel. Temples became central structures within early cities. At Göbekli Tepe, monumental pillars depict animals in relief, foxes, snakes, birds, carved with precision. The site predates widespread agriculture, suggesting ritual coordination may have catalyzed communal organization. If belief preceded farming, then shared cosmology may have been the true seed of civilization. Belief binds strangers, yet belief also centralizes authority. Priestly classes emerge. Narratives solidify. The oral flexibility of Paleolithic myth becomes codified theology. With codification comes exclusion. Alternative interpretations fade. It is here that the possibility of subtle erasure enters, not through conspiracy, but through consolidation. Once cities dominate, histories of mobility are reinterpreted as backwardness. Sedentism becomes destiny. Anthropological records show that even in recent centuries, nomadic groups have been pressured into settlement by expanding states. Their knowledge systems rooted in movement are often marginalized. If this dynamic operated historically, then the narrative of civilization may obscure parallel lifeways that persisted for millennia. The archaeological record reveals that agriculture spread unevenly. In parts of Europe, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers coexisted alongside Neolithic farmers for generations. Genetic studies indicate intermixing, but also cultural tension. Choice persisted. The 100,000 years before cities were not an empty waiting room. They were an era of experimentation without permanent monuments. Recent discoveries continue to reshape assumptions. In Kenya, stone tools dated to over 300,000 years ago push back technological origins. In Morocco, early Homo sapiens fossils challenge previous geographic models. The map of early humanity expands each decade. As evidence accumulates, the image of ancient humans becomes less primitive and more nuanced. It is tempting to ask whether a lost advanced civilization preceded known history. Responsible scholarship finds no material proof of such technological sophistication. But the absence of machines does not imply absence of depth. Depth can exist in systems that do not fossilize. Consider language itself. Linguists reconstruct proto-languages by comparing modern tongues, tracing divergences backward thousands of years. Yet beyond a certain horizon, linguistic ancestry dissolves. Sound shifts erase evidence. Words vanish. What conversations fill the Paleolithic air that no ear now remembers? If human cognition reached modern capacity perhaps 70,000 years ago, then the stories told around fires during glacial nights may have been as intricate as any epic later inscribed. Perhaps the difference lies not in intelligence but in preservation. Stone preserves, wood rots, voice fades, civilization privileges stone. When sea levels rose after the Ice Age, coastlines where early humans thrived were submerged. Marine archaeology is revealing hints, stone tools, submerged ridges, but vast areas remain unexplored. The idea that entire communities lie beneath modern oceans is not fantasy. It is geological inevitability. Yet even if such settlements existed, they need not have resembled modern cities to be complex. Complexity is not measured solely in height or metal. The Paleolithic spanned multiple glacial cycles. Humanity endured. Civilization spans a single interglacial. This proportion invites humility. What if the true mystery is not why civilization took so long, but why it appeared when it did? Why did permanence suddenly outweigh flexibility? Why did accumulation eclipse adaptation? Perhaps the Holocene's rare climatic stability created a seductive illusion of control. If stability is transient, then civilization may be contingent. The long prelude of mobility suggests that humans are capable of surviving without centralized systems for vast stretches of time. The last 12,000 years demonstrate a different capacity, the ability to reshape the planet rapidly. Both capacities belong to us. As cities expand and global systems intertwine, the question returns quietly. What lessons from those 100,000 years remain relevant? The silence before civilization is not a void to be filled with fantasies. It is a reservoir of forgotten strategies, and as the Earth continues its slow cycles, warming, cooling, shifting, the mirror of that reservoir waits patiently, reflecting a species that once moved lightly across its surface. Whether that reflection is warning or invitation remains unresolved. If stability was an illusion, then perhaps civilization was built not upon certainty, but upon a brief pause in chaos. For most of human existence, the planet was restless. The Pleistocene epoch, stretching over 2.5 million years, was defined by glacial cycles, ice advancing and retreating with rhythms far older than any myth. Within that epoch, Homo sapiens emerged and endured. The species did not arise during comfort. It was forged in oscillation. Ice cores drilled from Antarctica reveal a jagged pattern of temperature swings. Some shifts occurred gradually, others abruptly. These were not minor fluctuations. Entire ecosystems would reorganize. Coastlines expanded outward during glacial maxima, exposing continental shelves as habitable land. During interglacial melt, seas rose and consumed those same territories. Imagine generations living along a fertile coastal plain, fishing, gathering shellfish, hunting terrestrial game, only to watch the ocean creep inland decade by decade. Not a single catastrophic wave, but a persistent encroachment. Memory would record the loss in story. Modern bathymetric maps show submerged river valleys off the coasts of India, Southeast Asia, and the North Sea. In 1931, fishermen dredging the North Sea recovered worked flints and even fragments of bone tools from what had once been Doggerland, a Mesolithic landscape connecting Britain to mainland Europe. It was not a mythic continent. It was real ground, now hidden beneath water. Such evidence does not point to lost empires of impossible technology. It points to ordinary human communities erased by geological inevitability. And yet, erasure has consequences. When landscapes vanish, so do the markers of memory. Burial sites disappear, sacred places sink, trails that once structured migration are severed. Perhaps the transition to settlement was, in part, an attempt to anchor memory against erasure. Monuments resist drowning, at least for a time. Göbekli Tepe stands as a symbol of this paradox. Constructed by hunter-gatherers around 9600 BCE, its massive pillars suggest organized labor beyond subsistence needs. It predates pottery and permanent villages. Its builders deliberately buried it centuries later, covering their own creation. Why conceal such a structure? Archaeologists debate. Some propose ritual closure. Others suggest environmental shifts or social change. The act of burial, however, preserves. If earlier coastal sites were abandoned to rising seas without intentional preservation, then their absence today reflects both nature and choice. Choice becomes a recurring thread. The emergence of agriculture was not uniform or immediate. In China, rice cultivation developed independently. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated from teosinte through careful selection over millennia. These processes required patience and observation, but domestication alters relationship. Where once humans followed wild herds, now animals were bred within fences. Where once seeds were gathered opportunistically, now fields were sown deliberately. Deliberation fosters control. Control fosters hierarchy. The archaeological layers of early cities reveal stratification. Larger dwellings adjacent to smaller ones, centralized temples dominating skylines. Social roles became fixed, yet the Paleolithic likely possessed its own hierarchies, elders, skilled hunters, ritual specialists. The difference may lie in scale. Scale magnifies impact. As populations grew within settlements, disease spread more easily. Bioarchaeological studies indicate increased rates of infectious illness in early agricultural communities. Sedentism concentrated waste. Sanitation lagged behind density. Civilization offered new vulnerabilities. The question then arises, why did humans persist with this experiment if it introduced hardship? Perhaps because surplus outweighed risk. Surplus allows storage against famine. It allows specialization in craft, art, governance. It enables trade networks spanning vast distances. Obsidian from Anatolia appears in Neolithic Levantine sites. Shells from distant coasts decorate inland burials. Connectivity expands possibility, but connectivity also centralizes. With writing, connectivity extends beyond immediate presence. The earliest cuneiform tablets did not record philosophy. They tracked grain and labour. Administration preceded literature. Administration formalizes memory. Memory formalized becomes history. Everything before formalization becomes murky. Some modern thinkers argue that human consciousness itself shifted during the transition to civilization. The psychologist Julian Jaynes proposed the controversial bicameral mind hypothesis, suggesting that ancient humans experienced auditory hallucinations interpreted as divine commands and that introspective consciousness emerged gradually. His theory is widely debated and not universally accepted, yet it underscores a provocative idea that mental frameworks evolve alongside social structures. If social complexity alters cognition, then the difference between Paleolithic and urban consciousness may extend beyond architecture. Perhaps the long pre-civilized era cultivated attentiveness to immediate surroundings, wind, animal movement, celestial cues, while civilization cultivated abstraction, property, law, written narrative. Neither mode is inherently superior. They are adaptive to different environments. The Holocene stability may have favoured abstraction, but stability is not permanent. Geological records remind us that interglacial periods end. Climate shifts recur. The Pleistocene's pattern suggests that the Holocene is an exception rather than a rule. If civilization depends upon stability, then its foundation is thinner than it appears. For 100,000 years, humans survived without cities during instability. For 12,000 years, they have built cities during relative calm. This ratio invites reflection. What knowledge was honed during instability that modern systems neglect? Traditional ecological knowledge among indigenous communities today often reflects deep time understanding of landscapes. Fire management practices in Australia, for example, that shaped ecosystems sustainably for millennia before European colonization disrupted them. Such knowledge systems are not relics. They are continuations of ancient adaptive strategies. Perhaps the silence before civilization is not silent at all. It speaks through practices that persisted alongside cities, even as dominant narratives overshadowed them. When historians trace origins, they often begin with writing. But writing is a late technology. If humanity's first 100,000 years were spent refining cooperation, language, spiritual reflection, and environmental literacy, then civilization rests upon an immense invisible scaffolding. The scaffolding remains largely unacknowledged because it left no walls, and yet without it, no walls could stand. As oceans continue to rise in our own era, swallowing shorelines slowly but relentlessly, the memory of submerged plains feels less distant. The experiment of permanence faces its own test. If cities falter under environmental strain, if stability fractures, the ancient skill of mobility may regain relevance. The long silence before civilization may not be a forgotten prelude. It may be a rehearsal for futures we have yet to imagine. If the long prelude was a rehearsal, then what exactly were humans rehearsing for? For 100,000 years, they navigated a planet that rarely offered certainty. Glacial winds reshaped continents. Forests advanced and retreated. Herds migrated unpredictably. Survival demanded attention not to permanence, but to change itself. Change was the constant. When Homo sapiens first dispersed beyond Africa, likely in waves beginning around 70,000 years ago, they encountered climates radically different from those of their origin. They entered colder latitudes, adapted clothing technologies with bone needles, constructed shelters from mammoth bones in Eastern Europe, and crossed narrow sea passages into Australia long before ships as we understand them existed. Such feats were not impulsive. They required planning, cooperation, and perhaps something more subtle, a tolerance for uncertainty. Uncertainty is difficult to measure archaeologically, yet it may have been the defining condition of Paleolithic life. Contrast this with the rise of early states. By the time Sumerian cities flourished, kings inscribed their conquests into stone. Law codes, such as that attributed to Hammurabi centuries later, sought to codify justice. Writing attempted to freeze meaning. Freezing meaning reduces uncertainty, but freezing meaning also narrows interpretation. Before writing, narratives remained fluid. Stories could adapt to new landscapes, new experiences. A flood myth told near a coastline might carry different nuances inland. Oral tradition allowed elasticity. Elasticity may have been a survival tool. The emergence of agriculture around 12,000 years ago did not erase uncertainty, but it introduced predictability within controlled zones. Fields could be replanted, herds could be bred, storage could mitigate lean seasons. Yet the very act of mitigation may have altered perception of risk. Anthropologists note that hunter-gatherer societies often emphasize sharing as a buffer against scarcity. If one hunter fails, another may succeed. Surplus circulates. In agricultural societies, surplus accumulates centrally. Granaries become focal points of power. Power concentrates risk as well as reward. If a centralized harvest fails, famine can be catastrophic. History records such collapses. The fall of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE during prolonged drought, documented through both archaeological data and cuneiform texts lamenting dry fields. Climate proxies from sediment cores corroborate aridification during that period. Civilization is vulnerable to climate. Yet for tens of thousands of years before cities, humans endured climate extremes without collapsing as a species. Perhaps the rehearsal was not for building cities at all. Perhaps it was for surviving their collapse. This is not a prophecy, but a pattern. The Pleistocene shaped a species adaptable enough to cross continents and endure bottlenecks. Genetic studies suggest that at certain points, human populations may have dwindled dramatically, perhaps during events like the Toba supereruption around 74,000 years ago, though the extent of its impact remains debated. If such bottlenecks occurred, survival would have depended on flexibility and cooperation. Flexibility is easier when possessions are few. Civilization increases possessions. It increases interdependence. Interdependence magnifies both resilience and fragility. The 100,000 years before civilization were not devoid of social complexity. Evidence from burial practices suggests ritual attention to the dead. Engraved objects indicate symbolic communication. Migration routes reveal long-distance interaction networks, but complexity was distributed rather than centralized. Distributed systems can absorb shock differently. In ecology, diversity buffers ecosystems against collapse. Monocultures, though efficient, are vulnerable to disease and climate stress. Agriculture introduced monoculture into human subsistence. Monoculture increases yield, it reduces diversity. This parallel is striking. The Paleolithic may have represented a distributed cultural ecosystem, multiple small groups, diverse strategies, varied adaptations. Civilization introduced cultural monocultures, dominant states, standardized practices, centralized authority. Standardization simplifies administration. It also diminishes variation. Variation, however, fuels adaptation. When considering the long span before cities, it becomes less a void and more a laboratory of variation. Humans experimented unconsciously with social forms, spiritual frameworks, technologies suited to local conditions. Not all experiments left traces. The archaeological record privileges stone and bone. It rarely preserves wood, fibre, skin, song. Song is especially elusive. Ethnomusicologists studying contemporary indigenous groups suggest that music encodes navigational routes, genealogies, and ecological knowledge. Australian Aboriginal songlines map landscapes through melody. The land becomes a score. If similar systems existed tens of thousands of years ago, they would leave almost no material evidence. Perhaps entire knowledge systems evaporated simply because they were acoustic rather than architectural. When writing emerged, it displaced certain forms of memory. Literacy allows knowledge to extend beyond immediate presence, but it also externalizes responsibility for recall. Memory shifts from communal performance to individual reading. This shift is profound. The silence before civilization may partly reflect this displacement. What was once carried collectively became unnecessary once inscribed, but inscription cannot capture everything. Some anthropologists argue that modern industrial societies have lost certain intuitive, ecological literacies once common among foragers. The ability to read subtle environmental cues declines when daily survival no longer depends upon them. If the long Paleolithic cultivated such literacies, then the rise of civilization may have traded one form of intelligence for another. Trade implies gain and loss. Perhaps the question, what did humans do for 100,000 years before civilization, assumes that civilization is the culmination rather than one chapter. What if those 100,000 years were not waiting, but thriving in forms we have difficulty recognizing because they do not mirror our own structures? As glaciers receded and rivers settled into predictable courses, humans began to build walls. But the memory of movement lingered. Nomadic pastoralism persisted alongside agriculture. Trade routes connected distant regions long before formal empires. Mobility did not vanish, it coexisted. The rehearsal may never have ended, it may still be ongoing, encoded in migratory impulses, in the human restlessness that drives exploration even now. If permanence is fragile and climate cycles continue beyond human control, then the deep memory of adaptation may again become essential. The 100,000 years before civilization were not silent, they were formative. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is not that we have forgotten what happened then, but that we have underestimated what was already known. If we have underestimated what was already known, then the silence before civilization may conceal not ignorance, but refinement. For 100,000 years, humans refined the art of being human without leaving behind archives. They perfected cooperation in small groups. They mapped terrain not on parchment, but in muscle memory and story. They calibrated their senses to wind direction, animal spoor, the subtle shift in bird calls that signals a predator nearby. Such awareness is difficult to reconstruct from stone flakes and bone fragments. Archaeology, by necessity, studies what endures. But endurance can distort proportion. Monumental architecture once built insists upon attention. A cave painting survives because mineral pigment bonds with limestone. A wooden council structure dissolves into soil without ceremony. What if Paleolithic societies invested their ingenuity in perishable mediums precisely because permanence was not the goal? Ethnographic studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups reveal that social norms often discourage accumulation beyond immediate need. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, sharing is expected. Hoarding provokes tension. Mobility discourages storage. This is not romanticism, it is documented pattern. When agriculture emerged, storage became virtue rather than liability. Granaries symbolize security. Surplus allowed elites to form, Administrative roles crystallized, but surplus also required defense. Conflict leaves traces, fortifications, weapons, trauma on skeletal remains. Evidence suggests that interpersonal violence existed long before cities. Sites such as Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dated to around 13,000 years ago, reveal burials with projectile injuries. Competition over resources predates agriculture, yet the scale of organized warfare appears to intensify with sedentism. Sedentary life creates fixed targets. The long Paleolithic may have known violence, but mobility limited escalation. Groups could disperse rather than entrench. Entrenchment defines states. Once states formed, narratives justified their existence. Myths of divine mandate, origin stories linking rulers to gods, legal codes prescribing obedience, all solidified hierarchy. Writing preserved these justifications. Pre-literate societies had myth as well, but without inscription, myths remained adaptable. They could shift emphasis according to circumstance. Adaptability is resilience. If civilization introduced rigidity, then it also introduced fragility. The archaeological record contains examples of collapse. The city of Çatalhöyük declined gradually. The Akkadian Empire fragmented under environmental stress. The Indus Valley civilization faded around 1900 BCE, perhaps due to shifting river patterns and climatic changes. Collapse is not anomaly, it is recurring. Yet the species endures. This endurance predates and transcends cities. The question of what humans did for 100,000 years before civilization may obscure a more fundamental inquiry. How did they think? Cognitive scientists propose that narrative cognition, our tendency to frame experience as story, may have evolved to enhance cooperation. Story binds groups around shared values and expectations. It encodes practical knowledge within memorable arcs. If so, then Paleolithic storytelling was not mere entertainment, it was infrastructure without stone. Consider the endurance of certain mythic motifs across continents, the trickster figure, the flood narrative, the hero's journey. Comparative mythology suggests deep roots for these archetypes. While not evidence of a single origin, their recurrence implies shared cognitive frameworks. Perhaps those frameworks crystallize long before writing. When agriculture tethered humans to land, narrative shifted from migration to origin. Cities required founding myths. Temples required cosmologies explaining order. Kings required genealogies tracing authority to primordial beginnings. Origin replaced journey. Journey characterized the Paleolithic. Journey implies openness. Origin implies fixity. Fixity comforts and constrains. The Holocene's relative climatic stability may have fostered this shift toward fixity. Stable seasons encourage planning. Planning encourages surplus. Surplus encourages hierarchy. Hierarchy encourages record. Record defines civilization. Everything before record becomes prehistory. Yet prehistory spans far longer than history. It encompasses the emergence of language, art, ritual, empathy. It contains the cognitive foundations upon which civilization rests. Recent discoveries continue to extend this prehistory. In 2018, archaeologists reported cave art in Borneo dated to over 40,000 years ago, including figurative depictions of animals. These works suggest that artistic sophistication was widespread, not confined to Europe. The global distribution of early art challenges older Eurocentric narratives of cognitive awakening. Human imagination was already expansive. If imagination flourished without cities, then perhaps cities are not the birthplace of complexity, but its reorganization. Reorganization can obscure origin, Ur. The silence before civilization is therefore not emptiness, but unrecorded abundance. One might ask whether the very question, what did humans do before civilization, reveals our bias. It assumes inactivity unless monuments exist. But monuments are only one expression of achievement. Achievement can be measured in survival, across glacial cycles, in migration across continents, in the continuity of oral traditions spanning millennia. Perhaps those 100,000 years were not preparation for cities, but preparation for continuity. Continuity requires humility before nature. It requires adaptability rather than domination. Civilization often equates progress with expansion, yet expansion carries ecological cost. If the Paleolithic sustained human populations for tens of millennia within dynamic climates, then its strategies merit attention rather than dismissal. This does not imply abandoning cities or romanticizing nomadism. It suggests recognizing that the foundation of humanity lies deeper than walls and scripts. As modern societies confront environmental shifts, rising seas, changing weather patterns, the deep memory of adaptation may prove more relevant than the recent memory of permanence. The rehearsal never truly ended. It persists in the resilience encoded within our species. The silence before civilization, once considered void, may instead be the longest chapter of human wisdom, written not in stone, but in survival itself. And if survival without monuments defined most of our history, then perhaps the question is not what humans were doing before civilization. Perhaps it is whether civilization has forgotten what humans once knew. If civilization narrowed possibility, then another question rises slowly from the quiet margins. What exactly was narrowed? For 100,000 years, human groups were small enough that every face was familiar. Decision-making unfolded in proximity. Reputation mattered. Conflict could not be outsourced to bureaucracy. It had to be negotiated within the circle of shared survival. Anthropologists studying contemporary foraging societies often observe complex social mechanisms designed to prevent dominance from calcifying, joking rituals that humble skilled hunters, food-sharing norms that prevent hoarding, collective child-rearing that diffuses ownership of the next generation. Such systems are not accidental. They are social technologies shaped by long experimentation. When agriculture took root, scale shifted. Villages became towns, towns became cities, faces multiplied beyond memory. Reputation no longer sufficed to regulate behaviour among strangers. Law codes emerged not simply to control, but to coordinate. Coordination at scale is an achievement. Yet coordination at scale requires abstraction. A law written on clay applies equally to those who have never met. It detaches justice from personal context and reattaches it to principle. Principle can protect fairness. It can also enforce rigidity. The Paleolithic likely operated through contextual ethics, decisions embedded in relationships and immediate circumstances. Civilization gradually elevated codified ethics, rules applicable across territory. Both systems contain strengths. Both carry risks. In small groups, exclusion can be swift and unforgiving. In large systems, injustice can become institutional. The question is not which is superior, but which is resilient under stress. Archaeological evidence from sites like Çatalhöyük reveals early attempts at communal living without centralized palaces. Houses were similar in size, clustered densely. Murals and symbolic art adorned interiors. The dead were buried beneath floors, integrating ancestry into daily life. This was not yet a stratified empire. It was a transitional experiment. Over centuries, however, complexity intensified elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose. In Egypt, pyramids anchored divine kingship. Monumentality became statement. Statement becomes narrative. Narrative becomes history. History privileges continuity of the state. Prehistory, by contrast, privileges continuity of the species. For 100,000 years, Homo sapiens endured without the scaffolding of centralized institutions. They adapted to glacial cold, tropical humidity, arid plains. They crossed land bridges exposed by low sea levels. They developed watercraft sufficient to reach Sahel, ancient Australia, by at least 65,000 years ago. These journeys required collective planning and trust across uncertainty. Trust may be the invisible foundation of the Paleolithic. Trust does not fossilize. Yet trust leaves traces in cooperation. Cooperation leaves traces in survival. Genetic data reveal that despite bottlenecks, human populations rebounded. The species did not fracture irreparably under environmental stress. This resilience suggests networks robust enough to withstand fragmentation. When agriculture centralized communities, trust extended beyond kin, but became mediated by authority. Institutions replaced intimacy as guarantors of cooperation. This shift altered human psychology subtly but profoundly. Sociologists argue that as societies scale, individuals experience anonymity. Identity shifts from relational to categorical. Citizen, subject, labourer. In the Paleolithic, identity may have been more fluid, embedded in direct interaction. Fluidity adapts quickly. Categories endure. Endurance is double-edged. Perhaps what narrowed during the rise of civilization was not intelligence, but range. Range of movement, range of social form, range of ecological relationship. Agriculture ties survival to specific crops. Urbanization ties survival to infrastructure. Writing ties memory to external artifacts. Each innovation expands capacity while reducing alternative pathways. For 100,000 years, humans cultivated alternatives through necessity. Archaeological discoveries continue to challenge assumptions of simplicity. In the Levant, evidence suggests that even before full domestication, communities managed wild cereals intentionally. In Japan, Jomon societies developed complex pottery traditions, while remaining largely hunter-gatherers for millennia. Pottery does not belong exclusively to farmers. This complicates linear narratives. The Paleolithic was not a static stage awaiting advancement. It was dynamic, regionally diverse, temporally layered. Perhaps the discomfort arises from recognizing that the majority of human time unfolded without cities, without scripts, without kings. Civilization, though monumental, occupies a slender fraction of our timeline. And within that slender fraction, modern industrial society occupies an even narrower span. If longevity indicates stability, then mobility and distributed social systems sustained humanity far longer than centralized states. This is not an argument against civilization. It is a recalibration of perspective. The long silence before cities may conceal modes of being attuned to flux rather than control. As climate scientists warn of accelerating environmental shifts in our era, the memory of adaptation across glacial cycles gains relevance. What strategies from those 100,000 years remain embedded in human cognition? What cooperative instincts lie dormant beneath layers of institutional mediation? The Paleolithic was not utopia. It contained hardship, scarcity, conflict. But it also contained resilience unmediated by bureaucracy. When sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, communities migrated. They did not petition an empire for relief. They moved. Movement was solution. Civilization transformed movement into exception rather than norm. Migration today is often framed as crisis. Yet for most of human history, migration was continuity. The narrowing may lie there, in perceiving mobility as disruption rather than adaptation. If the 100,000 years before civilization were defined by flexibility, then perhaps they offer less a lost golden age and more a reminder of range of strategies, range of identities, range of responses to uncertainty. The silence before history is not a void of ignorance, it is a reservoir of variation, and as systems built during a rare climatic calm confront new instabilities, the question emerges softly, almost imperceptibly. What part of that reservoir still flows within us, waiting to be recognized not as regression, but as remembrance? If remembering how they lived feels difficult, it may be because the evidence of their lives was never meant to last. Stone survives by accident. Bone endures when protected, but the majority of human existence unfolded in materials that decay: wood, fibre, skin, voice, breath. The absence of these materials in the archaeological record can create the illusion of absence in life itself. Yet absence of preservation is not absence of sophistication. For 100,000 years, human communities organised themselves without permanent architecture. Their settlements were temporary, but their relationships were not. Kinship networks likely extended across territories, connecting groups through marriage, exchange, and ritual gatherings. These connections created webs of resilience that no single drought or harsh winter could sever completely. Recent research into ancient DNA has revealed surprising patterns of mobility. Individuals buried in one region often show genetic markers tracing ancestry hundreds of kilometers away. This suggests that movement and exchange were not rare exceptions, but embedded features of Paleolithic existence. Movement does not mean chaos, it means circulation. Circulation distributes knowledge, it prevents stagnation, it allows innovation to spread without central authority. When agriculture emerged, circulation slowed. Fields anchored families to particular valleys. Rivers became axes of settlement. Mobility did not disappear, but it shifted from survival strategy to economic or military expansion. The rhythm changed. Before cities, time may have been measured less by calendar grids and more by cyclical return, of herds, of seasons, of stars rising in predictable arcs. The night sky, unpolluted by artificial light, would have been a constant companion. Constellations rotated above camps long before they were mapped formally. Some scholars propose that certain mythic narratives encode astronomical knowledge. While interpretations vary and require caution, it is undeniable that ancient peoples were attentive observers of the heavens. Survival demanded awareness of seasonal shifts, and celestial patterns provided reliable cues. Observation cultivates patience. Patience cultivates depth. Depth does not require monuments. The Paleolithic record reveals tools refined over millennia. Stone blade technology evolved incrementally, indicating sustained transmission of skill across generations. This transmission implies pedagogy, methods of teaching and correction embedded in community life. Teaching without writing relies on imitation, repetition, correction, encouragement. Such processes build strong social bonds. Perhaps what humans were doing for 100,000 years was perfecting the art of transmitting knowledge without dependence on external storage. When writing arrived, it amplified memory but also transformed it. Information could travel farther, but it no longer required direct human presence. Authority began to reside in text. Text stabilizes narrative. Stability can silence variation. It is tempting to imagine that something dramatic must have happened before civilization. An advanced society lost to catastrophe, erased deliberately or by nature. There is no reliable archaeological evidence supporting the existence of industrial or technologically advanced global civilizations tens of thousands of years ago. The material record does not reveal metals, machines, or urban infrastructure from that era. But the absence of such evidence does not imply absence of complexity. Complexity can be ecological rather than mechanical. It can be social rather than architectural. Anthropologists have documented intricate kinship systems among hunter-gatherer societies, with rules governing marriage, reciprocity, ritual exchange. These systems regulate cooperation across territories without written codes. Such governance is subtle. Perhaps civilization did not invent order. It formalized it. Formalization creates scale. Scale creates spectacle. Spectacle becomes history. History once written tends to begin where spectacle appears. Everything before becomes prologue. Yet the prologue lasted 100,000 years. In that span, humans witnessed volcanic eruptions, shifting deserts, megafaunal extinctions. They adapted to cold climates with tailored clothing and insulated shelters. They navigated waterways with early watercraft. Adaptation suggests foresight. Foresight suggests imagination. Imagination precedes inscription. When agriculture stabilized certain regions, imagination redirected toward permanence, temples, cities, monumental art. But imagination itself was ancient. Perhaps what changed was not intelligence, but orientation. Orientation shifted from horizon to foundation. For 100,000 years the horizon beckoned. After civilization, foundation anchored. Anchoring has consequences. It creates identity tied to land. It generates concepts of property, border, ownership. Ownership introduces exclusion. Exclusion introduces conflict. Conflict leaves ruins. Ruins become historical markers. The Paleolithic left few ruins because its strategies minimized accumulation and entrenchment. This does not mean conflict did not exist. It means conflict did not crystallize into empire. Empire requires surplus. Surplus requires stability. Stability was rare before the Holocene. The Holocene's relatively gentle climate created a window in which accumulation could thrive. Civilization may be less a sudden awakening and more a response to this climatic reprieve. If so, then the 100,000 years before cities were not dormant. They were adaptive responses to a harsher planet. As climate models project increasing volatility in the present era, the memory of adaptation becomes relevant again. Perhaps the silence before civilization is not something to decode for lost empires, but something to understand for lost strategies. What did humans do for 100,000 years? They endured without scripts. They cooperated without states. They remembered without archives. They imagined without monuments. And if imagination flourished without permanence, then perhaps permanence was never the ultimate measure of achievement. The quiet thought lingers. If the majority of human time unfolded without cities, then civilization may be a brilliant but brief flare within a much longer continuum. And flares, however luminous, eventually fade back into the night from which they rose. If civilization is a flare, then the night before, it was not darkness, but depth. For 100,000 years, humans inhabited landscapes that demanded attentiveness rather than domination. They learned the rhythm of migrating herds, the subtle language of clouds gathering over distant hills, the smell of rain before it arrived. Their survival depended not on rewriting the environment, but on reading it accurately. Reading is an act of humility. In small groups, humility was practical. No one could control the climate. No one could guarantee tomorrow's hunt. Cooperation mitigated uncertainty. Sharing distributed risk. Ritual reinforced trust. Trust was currency long before coinage. As agriculture expanded, trust was gradually supplemented and sometimes replaced by enforcement. Surplus required protection. Law codes emerged. Punishments were prescribed. The Code of Ur-Nammu and later Hammurabi inscribed consequences for theft and injury. Writing formalized morality. Formalization introduces permanence. Permanence invites authority. Authority centralizes narrative. Yet beneath every city layer, beneath every inscription, lies soil shaped by those who lived without such mechanisms. Archaeological strata in the Fertile Crescent reveal earlier layers of habitation beneath later urban construction. Each new structure overlays old traces. The physical act of building often obscures what came before. Metaphorically, civilization overlays prehistory in similar fashion. The question of what humans did before civilization may itself be shaped by the dominance of the later layer. We ask what they did because we assume that building cities is the measure of doing, but survival through glacial maxima is doing. Crossing continents without maps is doing. Maintaining oral continuity across thousands of years is doing. Recent paleoclimatic research shows that the Pleistocene climate was marked by abrupt shifts, known as Danskard-Ushka events, rapid warming episodes followed by cooling. These swings could occur within decades. Such volatility would have tested every human community. Yet the species persisted. Persistence suggests strategies robust to fluctuation. Civilization, by contrast, flourishes during stability. The Holocene's relatively stable climate allowed agriculture to expand. But even within this stability, civilizations rose and fell. The Maya experienced collapse linked in part to drought cycles. The Akkadians faced aridification. The Indus Valley saw shifting river courses. Collapse does not erase humanity, but it erases cities. If one imagines a future archaeologist excavating remnants of modern metropolises thousands of years from now, what would they infer about our time? Would they see brilliance, fragility? Both. The 100,000 years before civilization left fewer visible scars. Their footprint was lighter. Light footprints endure differently. Perhaps that is why the silence feels mysterious. It resists spectacle. Spectacle attracts attention. Silence invites reflection. When myths speak of golden ages before decline, they may reflect nostalgia rather than fact. Yet nostalgia often encodes longing for balance. Whether or not such golden ages existed materially, the recurring motif suggests an intuition that something shifts when power concentrates. Concentration simplifies governance. It also magnifies error. In decentralized systems, mistakes are localized. In centralized systems, mistakes ripple widely. The Paleolithic's distributed networks may have absorbed shocks more effectively. As modern societies grapple with global interdependence, the contrast becomes striking. For 100,000 years, humanity navigated a planet in flux without centralized global systems. Today, supply chains span continents. Communication is instantaneous. Decisions in one region affect distant ecosystems. Scale has expanded beyond anything earlier humans experienced. And yet, the cognitive architecture that enabled survival during glacial cycles remains embedded in us. Empathy, cooperation, narrative. These are not inventions of cities. They are inheritances from the long night before them. Perhaps the mystery is not what was lost before civilization, but what persists beneath it. Under layers of law, infrastructure, and digital record, human instincts shaped in small bands endure. The impulse to gather around shared stories, the instinct to protect kin, the capacity to adapt when circumstances demand. Civilization often presents itself as culmination, but in geological time it is recent. If the Holocene ends and climate shifts accelerate, the skills honed during the Pleistocene may regain prominence, not as regression, but as reactivation. Movement may once again become solution. Flexibility may once again outweigh permanence. The 100,000 years before cities were not waiting for monuments. They were cultivating resilience. Resilience is quiet. It does not demand inscription. It does not erect statues to itself. It persists in the background, unnoticed until required. And perhaps that is the final layer of the silence, the recognition that what humans were doing for 100,000 years was not preparing to build civilization. They were preparing to survive whatever followed it. As the flare of permanence illuminates our current age, casting long shadows behind it, the depth of that earlier night remains intact, vast, patient, unrecorded, and within that depth lies a question that does not accuse, only echoes. When the light of our own monuments fades, which part of us will remember how to walk in the dark?